Hello. Good evening, everybody. My name is Christine Böhler, and I'm the director of the culture program of ERSTE Foundation, and I welcome you very warmly here tonight. I welcome you because these talks take place on the occasion of a workshop conference which is happening in this room outside, the tables which you see connected to a project which we do together with World University Service, which is called Patterns Lectures. And Patterns Lectures is a project which wants to help to bring in courses on contemporary arts and culture to universities in Central and Southeastern Europe. And we meet here for the final conference of the course, and we have two people here tonight which will present you talks. One is Ruth Noack, who she will start, and the other one is Susanna Milewska. Ruth Noack is also doing a workshop tomorrow with the lecturers for the whole day. The Patterns program, just quite briefly, is ongoing, a strategic thing which we follow to help research on contemporary arts. You also find outside on the book table some products out of that and might have a look afterwards. So the question for tonight, how to become a curator, is a title. Some people approached me and said, finally, there will be an answer. I'm pretty sure there will be no answer, and it was not meant to be answered. It comes out actually as a very diminished phrase out of Susanna Milewska's text on her speech, where we already have to implement the neglection of a final concept and answer. And the question will be risen on education, on knowledge production, self-differentiation of an art historian in his or her professional development. Susanna Milewska will approach the subject of curating through the looking glass of an art historian and theorist. Susanna Milewska, who will be talking after Ruth, is a theorist of arts and visual culture and also a curator. She obtained her PhD at the Goldsmith College in London and was from 2006 to 2008 the director of the Center for Visual and Cultural Research in Skopje, Macedonia. She curated more than 70 international exhibitions. Her texts on the construction of national identity and gender differences in the Balkan art and visual culture have been widely published. She did for a couple of years the research and exhibition and publishing project, The Renaming Machine, on the construction of language and national identities, where she also did this publication mentioned. She published the book Gender Differences in the Balkans and worked on as a researcher for the Gender Check project, which took place in Mumok 4 years ago and in the Zachenta Gallery in Warsaw. For her work, she recently, last fall, got the Igor Sabel Award for Culture and Theory, which is also given by ERSTE Foundation, but the jury is our own jury, so we didn't do it because she also was nominated for the endowed professorship for Central and Southeastern European art histories at the Academy of Fine Arts, which we developed together with the Academy, and this is why I say there was a jury, also for that. I'm very happy that she's here tonight and gives this speech as the first professor for that. And now for Ruth, who will start now with her talk on ethical and pedagogical considerations for teaching the subject of curating contemporary art. Ruth's speech results out of her experience as head of curating contemporary art at the Royal College of Art in London. It is questioning the ethical and pedagogical implications of teaching the subject of curating. She points also on precarious moments in being or becoming a curator. Ruth was trained as a visual artist and art historian. Most of you will know her, maybe not the ones who are not from Vienna, but I guess, yes, she's actually from Vienna and lived here, and she curated Documenta 12 and did a lot of exhibitions also here. lost. Yeah, like the government exhibition, which was taking place in Witte de Witt, in MAC Miami, in Secession in Vienna in 2005. She provided the Garden of Learning in the Busan Biennial with its exhibition layout, and she curated the first Ines Dujak exhibition in London. Currently she's working, and this is very interesting, but maybe not the subject tonight, I was curious, she's working on the project Sleeping with a Vengeance, Dreaming of a Life, and also on the, also on the project Fragments and Compounds. After, in 2013, she left the Royal College of Art, and besides all that, she published a book on Sanja Ivekovic recently, and the book Agency, Ambivalence, Analysis, Approaching the Museum with Migration in Mind. So I will hand over to her, and also Georg Schöllhammer, who is right there, one of the advisors of the Patterns Lectures project, will afterwards do the moderation and hopefully bring in your input and hopefully bring the two ladies to talk to each other. And so Georg, as we'll see, if not. Georg, I want to say it, even if we are in Vienna, he's the founder of the editor of Springerin and did a lot of exhibitions and projects. He's the head of Transit AT and chairman of the Julius Scholar Society in Bratislava. He recently was part of the Soviet Modernism exhibition at AZW, and he published the Kvikulik book. This year it came out, a long-term project, and I tell you to take a look on the book. It's out on the book table. It's a great result of a really long research. So please take over.
Well, really take this serious about the book. The Kvikulik book is extremely exciting volume. I've already started showing it to my students. And thank you, Georg, for doing this work. It's absolutely necessary work. Thank you for having me here. I was very pleased to hear that I come from Vienna. I'm actually German, and I grew up in Germany and only came to Vienna to study and then to live here because I fell in love here. But I do identify with this as my hometown. My children were born here, and I just today caught myself saying we and meaning the Viennese, even though I haven't been here for almost 10 years now. I haven't lived here, so I really welcome the opportunity to return. Thank you, Christina, for inviting me, but also thank you for Markus for doing the technique, and thank you, Maria Dandl, who's made this a very smooth passage. When I devised my abstract and my title, I was still very, very mad at the Royal College of Art. And when it came to writing it, I had already been living in Prague, where I now have a guest professorship at the moment for over a month. And I was thinking, why was this so important to me? London is really very, very far away and not so relevant when looked at from Prague. And probably one of the things I love the city, I love London, and I love my students, but the thing I found most enervating in London was not the capitalism, which is really makes life hard, everyday life very hard for most people who live in the city, but was the fact that they think they're in the center, and because of that they really provincialize themselves. And it's really, you can see it in the art world, but you can see it in all kinds of attitudes. And so for me to be in Prague and live there for just a few months is like an antidote. It's I'm breathing again, because the Prague people, they know their worth, they know their value, but they certainly don't think that they're they're better or more important than other places, and they really try to connect to other places. And it's difficult in Prague to connect because the structures still don't function. You can't, the bookshops, aside from transit bookshop or so, a lot of the things that we take for granted in the West still are not functioning in the same way. I found this quite interesting also as an experience of everyday life. Anyway, so after the Royal College of Art, Ethical and Pedagogical Considerations for Teaching the Subject of Curating Contemporary Art is my title. This summer, I stopped teaching curating contemporary art at the Royal College of Art in London. I still miss my students and inspiring a lot of people. One of them recently wrote to me, and I cite from his letter. In terms of the final exhibition project, he writes, things are moving forward, but that is a given since we're supervised. In a way, I have already given up on trying to make it something substantial and just want to be given a task that I can do. Do it well and finish the course. In addition to the considerable cost of living in London, these students, who come from very divergent geographical and economic backgrounds, pay up to 65,000 euros to get their MA at the Royal College. Most of the curators I know count themselves lucky if they earn this sum in the same amount of time. In terms of earnings, exhibition making is not much of a career to be had. Nevertheless, young people line up to be entered into curating courses which promise and sometimes even deliver professionalization. The curating course at the Royal College continues to attract a large amount of applications because prospective students perceive of London as a central art world hub, because their parents identify the school as blue chip, and because in its over 20 years of existence, it was one of the first courses to be established. Only Grenoble was a bit quicker, sooner. The course has acquired the reputation of landing people in good jobs. Although if you look at closely, there are many museum directors or chief curators who come from the Royal College course, but if you look at it closely, they're mostly in the West, and they're mostly in Britain. So it's a very British-centered education, which is a problem because of the visa situation. So people come from what the British call overseas, an absurd term that only a colonial country like Britain could invent. And so they come from overseas, and overseas is almost also the continent, which means Europe, the non-British Europe, which is already very, very far away. And then they encounter an education that is quite focused on how the Arts Council functions, on how funding structures in England functions. But then after they finish studying, their visa is cut because of the recent changes in policies, so that they have to leave the country unless they get a job right away. And then they're not equipped to do the kind of job that they could be doing in England somewhere else, because they have not learned how to do it somewhere else. I think it's a problem, but that's another point. So the reality is a different one, and not just because the course is not any longer the only one around, and the increased output of trained curators has made the job market more competitive. It also has to do with the quality of teaching, which is decreased because of severe cutbacks. So not the teachers have lost qualities, but the amount of teaching that can be done is severely cut. Affecting teaching hours and production fund. The famous final exhibition of the curating course, which used to be funded with 40,000 euros 20 years ago, is now reduced to £15,000. It has to do with operational structures which are inadequate to an academic institution involved in studio-based art education. And most importantly, it has to do with a system which perceives itself as providing a service for customer, the student. Unsurprisingly, British academic providers, while taking their mission to equip students with knowledge, with skills, and critical thinking towards critical thinking quite seriously, do so against the backdrop of managing said students towards a satisfactory experience of consumption. This is then not particular to the Royal College, and actually one might say that it is quite trivial. The economization of higher education, and this is something we have not only in Britain, also all over Europe, results in a contradiction which forces institutions, even where they might not want to police the borders of critical thinking in order to retain their basis of subsistence. The problem is not restricted to traditional institutions of higher education. Similar forms of analysis with similar results can be applied to other types of curating courses, which have sprung up in recent years. For instance, those offered by museums, private collections, or even art fairs and auction houses. I was recently a member of a panel of a conference of a private collection done by a private collection, and who are hiring. It's a kind of a association of private collectors who don't want to build their own museum, but they want to show their collections as in a museum. So they get young, what they call emerging curators, to curate the shows, and they sell this as a mentoring system. So they sell this as education. And it was quite astonishing to see what the effects are. There was one panel where the curator was invited. It was supposed to be based on what she had done with the collection, and they almost didn't listen to her. It was quite shocking, actually. Other examples are those courses in schools initiated by artists or curators from Moscow to Guangzhou, presently hyped as alternative to academic degrees. They promise a quicker access to institutional hegemony, a higher level of discursivity, sexiness in the form of closeness to the pulse of the art market or other forms of art world, and more agency to the individual. They might possibly be a more strategic route to self-optimization, or simply a better means to networking. And networking is a never to be underestimated factor in the ability of the majority of curators to sustain themselves economically, and we all know that, at least curators know that. What they all have in common is an indefatigable belief in the sense of professionalism. We're moving forward, but that is a given since we are supervised, my former student writes. What I find disturbing in this report is less the fact that students might feel lack of control in the process of making their own exhibition, an exhibition that they're then being judged upon, so it's their degree exhibition. We all know that this just prefigures a situation which might be overly familiar to all who are working within institutions and contexts with interests that diverge from those of the curators. What is disturbing is that the quote describes a status quo where what has been purged from the pedagogical situation are all instances of reflecting on the pedagogical situation itself. What has been exempted is the possibility of understanding a critical reflection of the pedagogical situation as part of the process of exhibition making. As if, on automatic pilot, the sense or senselessness of making a degree show, no matter what, is not questioned any longer. An exhibition project has been set in motion, and thus it needs to be completed. While I concur that it is reasonable within a degree course to expect an outcome which can be evaluated, the question remains why the transition to production mode has to be naturalized in such a disenchanting way. And there are many of my former students who've written to me quite disenchanted by this. And I know it from the year before as well, that there's a disenchantment going on because of this turning to pragmatism. So the smallest common denominator is what then is chosen for a subject of the show, for choosing the artists, for deciding on the display, well, they never get to audience, so that can be left out anyways. So it's reasonable within a degree course to expect an outcome which can be evaluated. The question remains why the transition to production mode has to be naturalized in such a disenchanting way. For what happens is that this transition is built into the teaching as ceteris paribus, a given not to be challenged, not even to be considered. I would propose that the reason for this lies in the institutional contradiction spelled out above, which instills an aversion against all forms of improvisation that might endanger the streamlined end product, an aversion founded on a fear of failure. It is a fear of failure of this product to appear, the exhibition to appear, or at least to appear in a professionalized form. Were this not so, the process might be governed in a different, more dialectical or more loving way. Who says that it is necessarily the teachers acting within the restriction of academic scheduling and the course handbooks that spell out the contract between institution and students, who get to determine how to proceed from idea to exhibition, or how to control the speed of the process, or when the switch to pragmatic mode is appropriate, or in which instance and at which stage might it make sense to question, change radically, or abandon the project. And who says that it isn't possible, even necessary, for students and teachers of a curating course to reflect critically upon these questions? And I think these questions are important beyond educational ethics, because the ideology contained in the practice of teaching curating contemporary art affects much more than the manner of how one acquires a degree. It spills over into a curator's perception of his or her own agency and his or her aptitude to fully grasp and even to influence the structures that govern the process of exhibition making. In other words, it seeps into the ethics of curating. When I was thinking about today's lecture, I remembered a film from my own curatorial past, Tout va bien, of which a sequence was used in a show curated by students of the Kunstraum Lüneburg with Roger Martin Bürgel and me, based on Alan Sekula's School is a Factory, and reflecting the neoliberal turn of the European university system. It was at the time when in Germany there were the first strikes because of this, because of Bologna at the time, which was a very new thing. And University of Lüneburg was one of the first of the so-called elite universities that was actually asked by the government to see whether these changes make sense and to experiment with them. So it was before Bologna was installed. And the students felt a need to reflect upon this in an exhibition, so they asked us to work on this as a topic. I would like to show you not this sequence, the one that we show at this exhibition, but another one from Tout va bien, taken from towards the end of the film.
Ça va être complètement froid. Serpent à sonnette, serpent à lunettes. Toujours décidé à faire la gueule? Tu ne penses pas qu'avec hier soir ça suffit, non? J'avais envie de baiser, toi pas. C'est la vie.
Tu provoques. Même si je n'avais pas envie de faire la gueule en me disant un truc comme ça, tu me donnes envie de la faire.
D'accord, et maintenant c'est moi qui ai tort de dire ça. Mais tu fais peser lourd les emmerdements que tu as dans ton boulot, tu sais. Attends. Écoute, tu penses pas qu'on peut en parler plus calmement, non? Bon, il y a deux choses. Il refuse de passer tes articles, et tu n'arrives pas à écrire. Tu sais, être incapable d'écrire, ça arrive, il ne faut pas te frapper. C'est comme la circulation, ça.
La circulation?
Ben oui, t'es bloqué, quoi.
Je suis bloqué?
Mais je disais pas ça méchamment. Ah merde, à la fin, je vais finir par me demander ce qu'on fout ensemble.
Ne finis pas, commence.
Quoi, commence?
Commence à te le demander.
Bah oui, ce que je veux dire, c'est qu'on se retrouve, on va au cinéma, on bouffe, on baise, c'est tout, à peu près.
Ou à peu près.
J'ai oublié. Tous les 2 ou 3 mois, on s'engueule.
Tu viens de dire quelque chose d'intéressant.
Merci.
Oui, quand tu parles de ce qu'on fait ensemble, hein, tu dis on se retrouve, on va au cinéma ou ailleurs, on bouffe, on couche, on baise ou pas. D'ailleurs, redis-le, je suis pas sûre que c'est ça que tu as dit.
Tu es vraiment chiante, tu sais.
Redis-le.
On va au cinéma, on bouffe, on baise, et j'ajoute que j'en ai marre.
Et tu ajoutes que tu en as marre.
Ouais.
Et moi, je te dis que depuis hier, je me tue à te dire que si tu veux parler de ce qu'on fait ensemble, de ce qui va et de ce qui ne va pas, tu dois en dire plus. Plus. Bon, alors prenons hier. Tu tournes une pub. Mon article est refusé à l'agence. Je m'engueule avec la rédacteur en chef. On se retrouve. On va au cinéma. On bouffe. On couche. On baise ou pas. Tu pars faire le montage de ta pub et moi je rentre à l'agence. Alors tu vois la différence? Toi et moi.
Oh, j'y arrive pas, tu dis exactement la même chose que moi.
Ah, pour une fois, je ne crois pas. Pour une fois, je ne crois pas. Quand tu penses à nous, tu penses 1, 2, 3. Je suis d'accord avec tes rubriques cinéma, bouffe, baise. Mais comme toi, tu n'es pas satisfait. Je dis que pour penser ton insatisfaction, tu dois penser ce qu'il y a autour de ces rubriques.
T'as une seconde. Penser mon insatisfaction?
Oui, penser.
Alors c'est ça.
Ben oui, c'est ça, pas autre chose.
J'aurais dû m'en douter.
C'est toi. C'est toi-même qui as dit qu'on ne peut pas penser la sexualité en soi.
Oui.
Mais puisque tu l'as dit, fais-le. Pour une fois qu'il s'agit de toi. Tant, mais qu'est-ce qu'on fout ensemble tout à l'heure? Ça revient à avoir par rapport à nous une seule image dans la tête. Mets cette photo sur ton front. Avoir cette image dans la tête. La main d'une femme sur un queue d'un mec. Penser que ça te satisfait moins qu'il y a 3 ans.
C'est fini ce happening, oui.
Attends, cette image-là, moi je l'ai dans la tête comme toi. Mais comme toi. Et je sais très bien ce que je fais avec toi, tu l'as dit, on bouffe et on baise. Mais pour pouvoir penser à ce plaisir et à son évolution, moi j'ai besoin aujourd'hui d'une image de lui au travail.
Regarde le cadre. Vous allez en jaune, vous tenez vos cuisses.
Et de cette image-là.
A word
Et de
which
cette
endures
image-là,
marking
une image de moi au travail.
What's the matter, Sue? It's just crap. I can't record it.
Alors tu vois, c'est un peu plus compliqué. Alors tu me parles de ton boulot?
Tu fais chier. Il n'y a vraiment rien à en dire.
Alors pourquoi tu continues à le faire?
Mais parce que ça nous permet de vivre. Et de vivre comme ça, entre autres choses. Tu sais très bien à quoi ça a correspondu pour moi de me décider à ne plus faire que des pubs. Toi aussi, tu étais d'accord sur ma position. Tu trouvais ça beaucoup plus honnête.
Ça fait 3 ans qu'on vit sur cette honnêteté. On pourrait peut-être faire le point, non?
Non, j'en ai marre de cette discussion à la con. On en reparlera ce soir. On en reparlera ce soir, hein?
T'as peut-être raison.
Okay. Maybe some of you might wonder why I showed you this clip, which seems very far from the issues that I'm discussing tonight. After all, it deals with a couple who are enacting a crisis in their relationship and not with curating, despite the nicely adorned mise-en-scène replete with Andy Warhol and Niki de Saint-Phalle and so on, other knickknacks. But what the character played by Jane Fonda points out is also a valuable lesson to both teaching curating and to curating itself, though in obverse form. She demands that the situation the couple is trying to analyze needs to be looked at from more than one angle, the angle of heterosexual intimacy. The context of work needs to be considered, of working. And almost in a tongue-in-cheek move, the film shows that she as well, is forgetting to look at the full picture by neglecting to include the cleaning woman in her analysis. I always wondered how conscious Godard and Gorin were here in 1972 when they made the film, in alluding to an intersectionality that the student movement had not yet fully admitted to in their focus on ungendered class struggle. Obversely, the teaching of curating must look at curating from more than an angle of professionalism or of work. It must widen the scope to consider and thus open up to criticism the terms of the pedagogical situation itself. If it does, the ideology of professionalism emerges as a chimera. We cannot erase relationships and desire, flaws and fissures, serendipity and luck from the equations of teaching or of exhibition making, even if we abstract from them. And we might not even want to erase effective relationships from our work, but rather make use of them, work with them, allow students to learn dealing with them. After all, affective encounters are part of the daily business of curators, not only about, we all know the stories of how difficult artists are to deal with, or the artists are saying how horrible the curators are abusing their power position, this kind of struggle and thing that you really encounter in a daily process of curating. But so not only as that, but also as an aspect of aesthetic experience that needs to be considered. Surely to teach curating as a discipline means teaching production skills and knowledge, means teaching art history, and art history, and art history. Means teaching the ability to use and forge categories. That means really teaching philosophy, not just theory. Means teaching not only political and economic theory, but also connoisseurship and truffle pigness. Truffle pigness. It's not a word the word exists, but it's quite an important word. Surely to teach curating means to ask students to abstain from narcissism and to get to the points that matter, to be a go-between relating artists, art, institutions, audience, or public, but also to learn how to inhabit this position as a form, or to find a form for this position or for this practice. Yet beyond all this, I propose that we abstain from teaching curating as a profession and instead embrace the idea of a radical amateurism, one that allows for freedom from the constraints of the necessity to produce and to function, and be it the freedom of understanding or acting against the power relations that continue to construe each and all pedagogical situations. Thank you.
I just want to thank everybody who welcomed me here, starting with the Academy of Fine Arts and the ERSTE Foundation, and everybody who came tonight, and also to Ruth, who at the beginning of her presentation, it felt as if she was reading my own biography, because I was a student in London, although not at Royal College of Art, and I almost cried because I could easily relate to the students who have to pay all these fees and getting nowhere. But in fact, I didn't go to London to study curating. I was studying visual culture, and I've never studied, in fact, curating. And it feels really from the position of layman, of amateur or ignorant schoolmaster that I'm giving this lecture tonight. And it wasn't the title, the original title had nothing to do with becoming a curator, therefore. And I will try to explain what is this difference between becoming curator with slash and becoming a curator. So this lecture is based actually on a text that was just published in Becoming in the Curatorial, a book that was edited by Jean-Paul Martinon, which offered a philosophy of curating, and for a really very funny reason, he decided to advertise the book with the slogan, "Stop curating, start thinking." So I'll try to somehow explain what is my presentation about and how it relates to this slogan. I will focus on the events of becoming curator, and I particularly intend to discuss the Deleuzian concept of becoming in the context of self-differentiation and self-reification of an art historian as an art curator. The main challenge to be discussed here is how a person knows what he or she knows as a curator, and how one reconciles the contradictions and conflicts stemming from being art historian and becoming curator. So I forgot to mention I was trained just in art history. My BA was in art history, and later on I studied also in Prague, and I could also relate to it, Prague's experiences of Ruth. I refer to two movements that, according to Deleuze and Guattari, are always necessary for this becoming to take place. They first stipulate that there must be a certain isolation from the majority, and I interpret this first movement when becoming curator emerges as potentiality. Then a certain isolation must occur from the minority, namely when a curator is recognized as such, or he or she is profiled and recognized as a curator through the events of curating. So these two conditions are predetermined by a complex and rhizomatic grid of relations and knowledge exchange between the curator, the artist, institutions, and the audience. This does not give the curator a kind of essentialized position. In order for the curator to remain recognized through each movement in this chain, he or she has to be involved in the becoming. When and how becoming curator takes place has intrigued me for quite some time. According to the Deleuzian concept, this is not the same as an accumulative process through which one gradually becomes a curator. It should be emphasized that these questions are not directly related to the personal decisions that make someone choose the profession of curating, or to the educational process. As I mentioned, I never got a degree in curating, so it wasn't so clear in my life that from now on I get a degree and I become a curator. In other words, to investigate the concept of becoming curator is not the same thing as to ask how a woman or a man decide to become a curator, and or to investigate the circumstances that have helped one to outgrow the art historian normativity. Although these questions, and of course you can study something else before becoming curator, although these questions are also important for the conceptualization and development of a curatorial career. This is not the same as to say that the two professions necessarily contradict to each other, but tensions do exist. I must say that many curators who have been trained as art historians can never really overcome this, and when they get to curate big exhibitions, for example, they really want to show off their art historian knowledge as well, but there is always a tension within an exhibition where you decide to present many different examples from your previous past, and I often ask whether we really need to see all these historic examples. So, art history versus curating. I want to address how art history relates to both theory and practice of curating. For example, in recent times, writing the art history of curating has provided a point of interchange between the two distinguished professions, the art historian and curator. However, the former is still assumed to be more theoretical and the latter more practical, especially because of the early schools of curating, where there was most of the subjects were like shipping, insurance, and that was why I didn't want to enroll any of these kind of courses. So I will just give one example of one of my first projects, where actually I was invited by the young artist Violeta Čapovska right after I completed my MA in History and Philosophy of Art and Architecture in Prague. I went back to Skopje, and this young artist came back from Australia, where she already moved to, and she invited me to climb 1,200 meters on the peak of Pelister. At that time, I just wanted to do something, and I was very happy that I was invited without fully understanding, what exactly it means. So we had to climb this peak together with the artist. She was doing whatever she imagined that would be her land print project. She was a printer trained in very conventional printing, but in fact she made a performance, land print project, she called it. And we went there with this is the lake on the peak of Pelister mountain, and we went there guided by alpinists. So that was immediately how I became aware of interdisciplinarity of the profession of curator. So this is our crew, and we had also a camera with us. There were about 10 participants that were invited, just friends and as audience. So this was one of these events, let's put it this way, very important formative events in my life. But it wasn't that as if I'm saying that that was the moment that I became a curator. It was the moment when I defined my position very high. This is just a joke, but it was actually a position where you work with the artist. You are not on distance of the artist from somewhere else speaking about the work, but you are working and somehow participating in the production of the work. Much later, in 2007, as the director of the Visual and Cultural Research Center in Skopje, I curated the research and educational project Curatorial Translation. Some of the workshops that were realized in the framework of this project were specifically designated to discussions about the issue of real truth and truth in becoming curator. So it took me almost 13 years, something like that, to actually define what was going on in my life, to make this distance from my own position. And this was a project where we had 3 different topics. I curated only one workshop, translating theory into curatorial practice. There were intercultural curatorial translation and translational relations between curatorial concepts and artworks, or artists turning into curators. So the main aim of this 3-party workshop was to address the urgency of an epistemological debate about the positioning of contemporary curating in theoretical and academic context in parallel to debates surrounding curatorial practice. And that is something like a kind of compensation for lacking of any kind of degree in curating or any kind of academic course in my country, but also in the region. The use of the term translation stood for the awareness of the confinements that appear whenever theoretical concepts are used as justification for curatorial choices of models, strategies, and attitudes towards art. Curating was interpreted as a cross-disciplinary profession that sometimes uncritically translates different theoretical concepts into exhibitions or other curatorial projects. Yes, what is that can make the curating based on scholarly concepts so different from curating that draws on various art projects? That was one of the questions, maybe because I was not trained as a curator. Are there any potential ways of reconciliation of these 2 models? This was an interface on Second Life that we made for this particular workshop, and this was my avatar waiting for the curators to come. We had several meetings on Second Life before the curators actually came to Skopje. Still waiting. I had assistant Biljana Tanurovska-Kulakovsky who was waiting for me for a while. with me, and then the curators arrived. The participants actually were really young curators at the time, but very ambitious, and I can see some of them here. Actually, it's really it was a very hard working atmosphere. So, and during this workshop, actually, it was the first time that we formulated somehow together this becoming curator as a potential. So we had many different speakers from abroad, and they were all enchanted by this workshop and surprised by this becoming curator topic. So what is this curatorial subject? What is this real and truth in the event of becoming curatorial subject? We already asked. In thinking what for a curator becoming subject entails, the final result of the complex physical and linguistic shifting of the process of subject construction is the emergence of a specific curatorial grammar that locates a certain voice, thus making a difference between who is speaking, which becomes irrelevant, and the speaking itself. Colebrook makes a difference between grammar of being and grammar of becoming, and I somehow like to implement this with this being art historian and becoming curator. At first, she identifies the grammar and logic of the subject as being tied to a certain way of speaking. The very concept of the subject is tied to a strategy of being and essence rather than becoming. And this is because the subject is not just a political category or representation, but a movement of grammar. The concept and logic of the subject as such, then, demands or provokes a movement of thought. And this is something that I really want to emphasize, this movement of thought, a specific temporality, and ultimately a strategy of reactivism, recognition, and being rather than becoming. So all these movements of thoughts for me were much more important than really this very kind of strategically developed moments of becoming a curator. Colebrook, in fact, offers a clear distinction between subjectivity, understood as fixed being, and becoming. Instead of subordinate strategy of the subject, she calls for a sustained strategy of becoming. According to her, the self it affects is not an essence but an event. Before there is a genesis that can be tracked back to an origin or condition, there is a multiple and synchronic stratification and structuring, not something located at a single point, but a creation of possible points through the event of lines, striations, and articulations. So I would really like to ask you to follow this with me, because now this is a kind of summary. Becoming in the Lewisian sense is thus not a process that happens through linear time and the result of dialectically overcoming certain obstacles or contradictions, but it is more about becoming the offspring of the event. Becoming subject is not about reacting in new identities, creating new identities, but more about coexistence and about expressing differences, but without overwriting them with one language. It is about emphasizing the speaking itself. And I often somehow compare curatorial condition, let's put it this way, with multiple personality syndrome. Because you need somehow to contain all these different positions of artists that you work with, which can be very contradictory to each other often. So it is obvious that subjectivity cannot be thought only as a majoritarian concept. Majoritarianism is affected by what Deleuze and Guattari named becoming minoritarian, and the mere possibilities of becoming minoritarian shape majoritarianism. There are many restraints that culture imposes on normal subjectivity in the form of biopower, and these restraints are mainly suspected and disavowed in becoming and becoming curator. So today, becoming curator has indeed become an emergent and self-aware position in the contemporary art world. Becoming here is a means to get outside. It's about negotiating the discursive constitution of subject, but McCormack, for example, reminded us not to forget that discourse is always corporeal. She says, because we are infleshed versions of the speech that constitutes us from culture without and from self-regulation or identification within. In order for there to ever be a potential for actual becoming, the potential of the body we are now must be recognized. And I must tell you that I did recognize this when I climbed this 1,200,000 meters. We were given aspirins to avoid the inflammation of muscles, but it didn't work. We also made a break in halfway. We slept for several hours. That was suggested by the crew. But still, when we got at the end, at the peak, all that I wanted was to sleep, not to record the performance. So while the courses and university departments of art history were for a long time not addressing curating, the departments that initially thought curating as a subject mainly focused on its practice. However, such a dichotomy no longer exists, and that curating is taught as a subject and course in many different departments and universities, and curatorial knowledge has become a term encompassing the philosophy, theory, and epistemology of curating. But that's really much recent. Therefore, becoming curator could be thought only through such destabilization of art history, I would claim. This coexistence of different languages and concepts, and in relation to the event, in relation to a curatorial project, statement, or a self-conscious utterance, in which a curatorial subjectivity emerges as a rhizomatic coexistence of multiple and non-hierarchical differences and lines of thoughts. Thus, becoming curator does not just happen through a process of education or with a decision to become a curator, regardless of how important these two starting factors are. Another really very important period in my life, which coincided actually with this first projects, was sitting in this tea shop for sometimes even 16 hours a day, mingling with artists and discussing projects, discussing postmodern art. I often say that I used to be militant postmodernist at the time. So we somehow coined terms, and we made them available in this situation where I could not get any job. So maybe you can argue that in fact it wasn't a choice. I became a curator only because I couldn't get a job as art historian. And this is also another possibility. So this is a part of our group. One of the artists actually overpainted this photograph and made this Last Supper as a kind of a first maybe feminist Last Supper in Macedonia. There was some comic strips also depicting this situation, this condition of becoming whatever, not only curator. And we actually went there with the curatorial translation workshop. We restaged this Last Supper once with the artist, and I often brought the students at the Faculty of Fine Arts to have workshops or even an exam there. It became a kind of part of not only my own personal history, but the history of intellectual life. So I will like to conclude quickly that I want to emphasize the need for questioning these power structures that Ruth also addressed in her talk in terms of becoming curator within the art and curatorial world. And there are several questions that I don't have the answer, as Christina already announced that we won't answer the main question, but there are more questions. If we were going to use the concept of the real in order to designate the existing but unsymbolized reality that can only be thought retroactively through truth procedures, what would then be truth of becoming curator? Can we think about this retrospectively? Can curatorial projects then claim that they produce knowledge and truth? Are curators self-aware that they always already contribute to ever more epistemological and constructivist concepts of truth? I'm sure there are many other questions. So the curatorial cognizing subject is not a fixed object. It is constructed by individual through his or her own experience of that object. The translational performance of the curatorial event resides between the two different ends of knowledge, the epistemological and the critical. I often mention this term curatorial agency, and Ruth also mentioned the agency. I'm not sure that we have the same kind of concept behind it. It is, for me, it is a concept that is indebted to the recent critical rethinking of the curator's role in the context of contemporary art, culture, and society. Similarly to Alfred Gell's concept of art as agency, which states that art has the power not only to passively represent the world, but also to act. Curatorial agency assumes in the same vein that the curator is no longer considered to be the author of an exhibition or a mere presenter of an already existing set of artistic concepts and projects. I actually wrote a kind of short entry for the handbook of curating that was edited by Nora Sternfeld. Which is out right now. The curator is rather assumed to be an active societal agent that contributes towards a cross-referential understanding of art between different artistic, cultural, ethnic, class, gender, and sexual camps, and moreover towards improvement of society in general. And that is how I defined the profession of curatorial. Before it wasn't there. When I started curating, there was no even term for curator in my country, so it was in a way easy, to fill in this empty concept. Becoming a curator has nothing to do with becoming curator. While the former is a pragmatic decision not only to make a living out of one of the sexiest professions available in the international art world, one that focuses on singling out emergent art concepts, art objects, and artists who produced either those concepts or objects. The latter is fundamentally related to one's own position in the world as a thinking subject. Not that anything is wrong with the professional art historian, but I assume that becoming curator is about opening up a new route in understanding art and the different way in which curators and artists position themselves in the contemporary art world and world in general. And this is not only about becoming in terms of building a career and defining the profession. There is no doubt that promoting new and provocative artistic concepts and models of productions is embedded already in any curatorial practice and position, but this is what I wanted to argue. Without the self-critical analysis and research-based and theory-based curatorial knowledge and agency, the event of becoming curator could never take place. This enables the continuous movement between becoming curator and unbecoming curator. And this is how I want to end my presentation.